The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. Captain Arsen stood on the rooftop of a ruined library, his eyes fixed on the horizon where flashes of explosions lit up the darkness like cruel fireworks. Below him, the city lay wounded, its streets littered with broken glass and abandoned belongings, the echoes of lives interrupted. His unit, barely a dozen soldiers, exhausted and hollow-eyed, was preparing to defend the old bridge, the last escape route for civilians fleeing the advancing enemy. Arsen's thoughts drifted to his childhood, to the same streets now scarred by war. He remembered running across that bridge with his friends, chasing kites in the summer wind. Now, the bridge was no longer a symbol of freedom but a fragile lifeline, a thread holding together the remnants of hope. He tightened his grip on his rifle, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. The soldiers around him whispered in hushed tones, some praying, others staring blankly at the ground. They all knew what was coming. The enemy would not stop until the city was ashes, until every last defender was silenced. Yet in their silence, Arsen sensed a strange unity. They were not fighting for glory or medals, they were fighting for the people who still believed in tomorrow. A sudden flare lit up the sky, casting long shadows across the ruins. Arsen raised his hand, signaling his men to take positions. The battle was about to begin. He inhaled deeply, the air thick with smoke and fear, and whispered to himself, "We hold the bridge, no matter the cost." The dawn broke with a crimson sky, as if the heavens themselves bled for the city. Captain Arsen's men crouched behind sandbags and shattered vehicles, their breaths shallow, their nerves taut like bowstrings. The old bridge stretched before them, scarred but still standing, its steel ribs trembling under the weight of destiny. The enemy came with thunder. Tanks rolled forward, their tracks grinding the pavement into dust, while infantry advanced in disciplined waves. The defenders opened fire, rifles cracking, machine guns roaring, grenades arcing through the air. The bridge became a furnace of noise and flame. Arsen shouted commands, his voice cutting through the chaos, urging his men to hold their ground. Smoke thickened, swallowing the world in grey. The cries of wounded soldiers mingled with the metallic shriek of ricochets. One of Arsen's youngest fighters, barely 19, fell beside him, clutching his chest. Arsen knelt for a heartbeat, pressing the boy's trembling hand, then rose again, fury burning in his veins. There was no time for grief, the bridge demanded sacrifice. Explosions tore chunks from the road, sending shards of steel into the river below. Yet the defenders fought with desperate courage, each man knowing that retreat meant the death of countless civilians still fleeing across the far side. The enemy pressed harder, their banners visible through the haze, their war cries echoing like a storm. Arsen's rifle jammed. He tossed it aside, grabbed a fallen comrade's weapon, and fired until his shoulders ached. His men mirrored his resolve, refusing to yield. For every step the enemy gained, they paid in blood. The bridge became a graveyard, but also a testament: hope could be defended, even against overwhelming force. As the sun climbed higher, the clash reached its peak. Arsen's voice rang out once more, hoarse but unbroken, "Stand firm. The city lives through us." The river beneath the bridge churned with debris, its waters reflecting the chaos above. Smoke rolled across the battlefield, swallowing the defenders in a suffocating haze. Captain Arsen wiped soot from his face, his lungs burning, his ears ringing from the constant barrage. The enemy had unleashed mortars, and each impact shook the bridge like the roar of an angry god. His men clung to their positions, battered but unyielding. The youngest among them, faces streaked with grime, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Every bullet they fired was a plea for survival, every grenade a scream against annihilation. Yet the enemy pressed forward, relentless, their armored vehicles grinding closer, their silhouettes monstrous in the smoke. Arsen spotted movement near the riverbank, enemy engineers attempting to plant charges beneath the bridge. If they succeeded, the lifeline would collapse, and the civilians beyond would be trapped. He barked orders, sending 2 sharpshooters to eliminate the threat. Their rifles cracked, and the engineers fell, but more came crawling through the rubble. The defenders' ammunition dwindled. Arsen counted the magazines left, too few. He felt the weight of time pressing against him, each second a reminder that their stand could not last forever. Still, surrender was unthinkable. He raised his weapon and fired until his arms trembled, until the barrel smoked hot in his hands. Suddenly, a massive explosion tore through the enemy's front line. For a heartbeat, silence followed, broken only by the cries of disoriented soldiers. Arsen turned to see a group of civilians, resistance fighters armed with stolen explosives, emerging from the ruins. They had struck the enemy unexpectedly, buying precious time. Arsen's chest swelled with renewed determination. Reinforcements had not arrived, but hope had. He shouted above the din, "We are not alone. Fight on!" The bridge roared with defiance, its defenders refusing to yield to the tide. The defenders clung to the bridge as if it were the spine of their own existence. The enemy's assault had slowed but not ceased. Waves of soldiers kept coming, their boots pounding against the broken pavement, their rifles spitting fire. Captain Arsen's men were exhausted, their faces pale, their hands trembling from hours of combat. Yet none abandoned their posts. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. The river below carried fragments of the battle. Helmets, rifles, even bodies drifting silently downstream. Arsen forced himself not to look too long. He could not afford despair. His duty was to the living, to those who still believed the bridge could hold. A lull came, brief and deceptive. The enemy regrouped, their banners visible through the haze. Arsen used the moment to rally his men. He walked along the line, touching shoulders, meeting eyes, reminding them that they were more than soldiers, they were guardians of the city's last hope. His words were simple, but they carried weight. We are the wall. If we fall, everything falls. Suddenly, the enemy artillery resumed, shells screaming overhead. The bridge shook violently, chunks of concrete collapsing into the river. One of Arsen's comrades, a veteran named Dimitro, was buried under debris. Arsen and two others clawed through the rubble, pulling him free, his leg mangled but his spirit unbroken. Dimitro grinned through the pain, still breathing. Still fighting. The hour stretched endlessly, each minute a battle of endurance. Ammunition was nearly gone, and the defenders resorted to scavenging weapons from the fallen. Yet their resolve did not waver. They fought with bayonets, knives, even bare fists when necessary. The bridge became a crucible, forging ordinary men into legends. As twilight descended, Arsen looked across the river. He saw civilians still crossing, clutching children, carrying bundles of their lives. That sight alone gave him strength. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer, one more hour. Just one more. Darkness descended over the bridge, cloaking the battlefield in shadows pierced only by the flicker of burning wreckage. The defenders were ghosts now, moving silently among ruins, their faces streaked with ash and blood. Captain Arsen crouched beside a shattered barricade, listening to the distant hum of engines. The enemy was preparing for another assault, heavier than before. The night carried whispers of despair. Ammunition was nearly gone, and the men were running on sheer willpower. Some clutched empty rifles, waiting to scavenge from the fallen. Others sharpened bayonets, their eyes hollow but determined. Arsen knew they were stretched beyond human limits, yet he also knew that surrender would mean the slaughter of civilians still crossing the far side. Suddenly, searchlights swept across the bridge, blinding beams cutting through the smoke. Enemy tanks advanced, their turrets glowing with menace. Arsen ordered silence, waiting until the machines were close enough. Then, with a signal, his men unleashed their last reserves, Molotovs hurled against steel, grenades tossed beneath tracks. Flames erupted, painting the night in violent orange. The tanks burned, but the cost was brutal. Several defenders were caught in the blasts, their cries echoing into the river. Arsen dragged one wounded soldier to cover, his hands slick with blood. He felt the weight of every life slipping through his grasp, yet he refused to falter. In the chaos, a strange calm settled over him. He realized that the bridge was no longer just a structure. It had become a symbol, a crucible where ordinary men defied annihilation. Even if they fell tonight, their stand would echo through history. Arsen raised his voice, hoarse but resolute. "We are steel in the night. Let them break upon us." His men answered with a roar, their defiance louder than the engines of war. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. The defenders were shadows among ruins, their bodies aching, their spirits frayed but unbroken. Captain Arsen leaned against the twisted remains of a barricade, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. The enemy had withdrawn temporarily, leaving behind silence heavy with menace. That silence was not peace, it was the prelude to another storm. Arsen knew it. His men knew it. They sat in the rubble, clutching weapons with trembling hands, whispering names of loved ones as if the words themselves could shield them. The bridge had become a sanctuary of defiance, but also a tomb for many. The dead lay scattered, their faces frozen in final resolve. Arsen walked among them, pausing to cover a fallen comrade with a torn flag. He felt the weight of every loss pressing against his chest, yet he refused to let grief consume him. Instead, he carried it like armor, a reminder of what they fought for. He whispered to the dead, "Your stand is not forgotten." Suddenly, the silence shattered. The enemy returned, this time with overwhelming force, columns of soldiers, armored vehicles, drones buzzing overhead. The defenders rose, weary but resolute. They fired into the advancing tide, their bullets carving defiance into the night. The bridge shook under the assault, flames licking its steel bones. Arsen's voice rang out, raw and commanding, "Hold! For every step they take, make them bleed." His men answered with a roar, their courage louder than the engines of war. The clash was brutal, relentless. Yet amid the chaos, Arsen felt something stirring, a strange certainty that their sacrifice was shaping destiny. Even if they fell, the echo of their defiance would ripple through the city, through history itself. The bridge was a furnace of fire and steel. The enemy's assault had reached its crescendo, columns of soldiers surged forward, armored vehicles thundered across the ruins, and drones rained death from above. The defenders, battered and blooded, fought with the last fragments of strength. Captain Arsen stood at the center, his uniform torn, his face streaked with soot, his eyes blazing with defiance. The night sky glowed red from burning wreckage, casting eerie shadows across the river. Every explosion shook the bridge, threatening to tear it apart. Arsen's men were dwindling, many had fallen, others clung to life with sheer willpower. Yet none retreated. They fought with bayonets, knives, even bare fists when ammunition ran dry. The bridge had become a crucible, forging ordinary men into legends. Arsen's thoughts flickered to the civilians who had crossed earlier. He imagined mothers clutching children, elders leaning on trembling hands, all carrying fragments of their lives. That vision fueled him, igniting a fire that no weapon could extinguish. He shouted above the chaos, "This is our stand. Let history remember us." The enemy pressed harder, their numbers overwhelming. Arsen felt the tide closing in, the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest. Yet in that moment of despair, a miracle unfolded. From the far side of the river, resistance fighters returned, armed with stolen mortars and rifles. They opened fire, striking the enemy from behind, splitting their advance. The defenders roared with renewed fury, their spirits rekindled. Arsen seized the moment, rallying his men for one final push. The bridge shook under their defiance, every heartbeat echoing like thunder. It was the breaking point. Either the defenders would shatter, or the enemy would. Arsen raised his weapon, his voice hoarse but unyielding, "For the city. For tomorrow." And with that cry, the night erupted into a storm of fire and courage. The first light of morning crept across the horizon, painting the river in hues of gold and crimson. The bridge, battered and broken, still stood, a scarred monument to resistance. Captain Arsen leaned against the twisted steel, his body weary, his uniform torn, but his spirit unyielding. Around him, the surviving defenders rose slowly, their eyes hollow yet burning with pride. The enemy had withdrawn. Their assault, relentless through the night, had faltered against the wall of defiance. The cost was staggering, too many comrades lay silent among the ruins, but the bridge had not fallen. Civilians had crossed safely, carrying with them the fragile promise of tomorrow. Arsen walked among the wreckage, pausing to kneel beside the fallen. He whispered their names, committing them to memory, vowing that their sacrifice would not fade into silence. The air was heavy with grief, yet beneath it pulsed a quiet triumph. They had endured. They had held. As the sun climbed higher, resistance fighters gathered on the far side, joining the defenders in solemn unity. Together, they raised a torn flag above the ruins, its colors ragged but defiant. The sight stirred something deep within Arsen, a realization that the bridge was no longer just a lifeline. It had become a symbol, a testament that even in the darkest night, courage could ignite dawn. Arsen's voice carried across the river, hoarse but resolute, "We are not broken. We are the city's heartbeat. And as long as we stand, tomorrow will rise." The survivors answered with silence, not of despair but of reverence. The bridge, scarred yet unbowed, echoed with the memory of the fallen and the promise of defiance. The war was far from over, but in that moment, hope lived.